And start also the recording. So good afternoon and welcome everyone to our social science webinar series. Sorry, I ask all the audience to switch off their microphones, please. Okay, I'm still hearing someone talking. Okay, so again, good afternoon and welcome everyone to our social sciences webinar series. Today we are very pleased to have with us Professor Robert Huggins. Professor Huggins is Professor of Economic Geography at Cardiff University and Director of its Centre for Economic Geography since 2011. He is also an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Sheffield and has held a series of honorary positions at a number of other institutions. As for his research interests, they mainly revolve around regional economic development, which is also the topic of today's lecture. In particular, the study of clusters and competitiveness, knowledge flows, entrepreneurship, innovation, and interorganizational networks. But alongside his academic research, he has also a strong consultancy track record, and he has worked with international bodies such as the European Commission, the OECD, as well as with national government, UK national government and regional authorities. And in particular, he is co-founder of the World Knowledge Competitiveness Index Initiative and the founder of the European Competitiveness Index Initiative. As for his most recent publications, there are two that I found really interesting. These are the first paper is very recent, Behavioral Explanations of Spatial Disparities in Productivity, the Role of Cultural and Psychological Profiling, co-authored with Thompson and published in Economic Geography. And then his recent book, A Behavioral Theory of Economic Development, The Uneven Evolution of Cities and Regions, 2021, again co-authored with Professor Thompson. The title of today's seminar, as you know, is Contemporary Perspectives on Urban and Regional Development, the Nature of Economic Change. Before leaving the floor to Professor Huggins, some few words on the organization of the seminar. The talk is supposed to last 1 hour, more or less, and then we open the floor for questions. For people who are attending the webinar via Zoom, I inform you that the webinar is recorded and also streamed on our YouTube channel. So if you have some privacy issues in being recorded, I kindly ask you to move to YouTube. From YouTube as well, you have the chance to asking questions. And speaking of that, I take the chance to thank my colleague, Maria Giovanna Brandano, who is collecting questions from YouTube for me. So that's all. Thank you again, Professor Huggins, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for those kind words as well. And it's interesting you mentioned those two publications because those are going to be featured in the presentation as well. But I'll kick off. I'll share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. And
yes, we can.
Good.
Yes, we can see them clearly.
Excellent. So I'm going to take another look at urban and regional development and thinking about how they change from an economic perspective. And I'm going to try to build in some of that sort of behavioral issues I mentioned earlier. And in many ways, I often look at this quote from Robert Lucas, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And he says, once you start thinking about economic growth and development, you can hardly think about anything else because there's so many different ways you can cut things up. So I'm going to give you a take today. It could be by next week that I think something else, something additional, because there's so many layers and it's such a complex area, but a fascinating area. I'm going to try to think about this economic change in the perspective of the evolution of cities and regions, and I'm going to try to place it around 3 different areas. Try to identify what we can think of being some of the principal drivers and fundamental determinants of economic change within an urban and regional environment. What are the principal systems and mechanisms? So upon which do these fundamental determinants play upon? So try to think about some of these systems. And then what are the processes? And in particular, some of the processes from an evolutionary perspective. How do things change and why? So I'm going to try to give you a sort of my own take on that, or trying to bring together some existing theories. As I say, try to identify some of these key drivers. And I'm going to place those in sort of 3 categories. Around capital, behavior, and institutions as well. And then in terms of these mechanisms, placing it, thinking about human agency, the networks that exist between human agencies, and what happens in terms of the connectivities within these networks, what actually flows. And for me, the principal reason is around the flow of knowledge. And I'm going to try to think about how we develop different development paths and how we create new paths. And argue that in terms of innovation I see as underpinning new path creation comes from entrepreneurship, and again comes from these flows between the different entrepreneurs and agents within particular regions and across regions. So that's my overall approach. Just to kick off, we know that things change across regions quite quickly, but also quite slowly over time as well. This is a chart showing the GDP per capita of the 12 regions in the UK for 2 periods. One fairly recent, 2015, and the other all the way back to 1891, which is some quite nice data. And we can see that over the period of time, the leading regions, London, South East, East of England, have all improved their position in terms of GDP per capita. And then towards the bottom, we can see some of the north, and where I'm situated at the moment in terms of Wales at this point in time. There's been a shrinkage, a relative shrinkage in terms of GDP per capita. So obviously there's different paths have been taken by these different regions over 100 years or so. But it's not always in the same direction. If we look at poor old Wales, you're in the red where I am at the moment. Wales was probably at its richest place compared to UK as a whole back in 1891, and has slowly, unfortunately, gone down. So again, we would say this sort of path locking in a negative way. London actually for many years was actually dropping as well. And we can see it's only until the 1970s that it's taken off again. But we know really there's been huge changes in terms of new path creation in London and some of the big cities around the world, which again have led to this increasing divergence. I want to explore some of the issues around that. And really in terms of trying to think about how we do that from a theoretical perspective, I've just put up 2 papers here from Ron Martin, fairly recent papers. And one he said, really, we need to think about it, maybe a more pluralistic approach with regard to economic geography. So trying to bring together different strands within the field. And also in the second paper, trying to think about how we can use economic geography to be a more transformative pursuit. So how can we actually really have an impact in terms of policy and practice? And I think these are both good messages. And what I'm trying to think about, how we can use some of our theories, use some of our empirics to actually produce better recommendations, or recommendations that are going to be more digestible, perhaps, to policymakers. So just to summarize, my 3 fundamentals around capital, institutions, human behavior. I'll say a little bit more around that. Then placing some of these mechanisms around it in terms of human agency, network dynamics, and knowledge flow. And then around here, it gets even more complicated and messy now. Try to think about some of these key processes, the roles of entrepreneurs, in progressing innovation, and then in terms of creating new path creation. So as I say, bringing together 3 theories. We know quite a bit about what we might call endogenous capital accumulation theory. That's largely the mainstay of growth theory. And at many levels, but within the regional level. We now have this emerging theory around institutions, which have just developed quite rapidly. And then we have this more nascent theory around behavior and the role of human behavior and human agency. So if you go back to just think about briefly around capital accumulation growth theory, basically growth theory or endogenous growth theory, we know that it's largely a theory based around preferences, where you're going to invest your capital, how much do you have, where do you allocate it, and all of that is underpinned by the intentional investment decisions made by particular decision makers, maybe by individuals, by firms within governments, etc. And we know the basic growth model comes from saying that output or change in output is a function of capital and labor. So largely capital in terms of physical capital, K, and then labor. But we know that over time, we've progressed this theory to have a better understanding around what other factors matter, which we use this term total factor productivity. And for me, total factor productivity is almost a proxy for a measure of innovation. So we've added this A into the theory we know now in terms of as being the technological progress or total factor productivity. And we've progressed with these theories over time to bring the three together. And we can see there's various variants in terms of this theory, but they're all endogenous in a way and result from intentional investment decisions. And from our perspective, urban regional development, intentional investment decisions made within the region. And two of the theories would be around, largely it's around thinking about capital in terms of knowledge. Lucas's theory, capital in terms of embodied within human capital, and then Rome, where we know what he terms of research capital. So it's the use of these investment resources, but actually generated by the economy itself. So knowledge is considered a spillover from one organization to another. And we know now that this spillover largely happens through different forms of networks. So understanding these networks. So we've seen this sort of proliferation, thinking about different forms of capital. I think many people in the UK, there's just been a new strategy launched in terms of leveling up. And they've taken this approach in terms of thinking about different capitals and how they can use these to actually develop weaker regions. There's numerous different takes on capitals. It's my own take, leading from physical capital all the way down to thinking about particular forms of human capital. Those may be involved in generating entrepreneurship, new businesses, and then the investment in resources to develop these networks. And we know that largely leads through to innovation. Innovation is going to be a key to understanding change, to understanding growth, and to understanding development. So if we look at it, this is just this one chart tries to show the relationship between countries in terms of GDP per capita on the x-axis and then innovation on the y-axis. And we can see that is this relationship, this strong positive relationship between innovation and overall economic development. And again, if we look at the chart I put together, looking at regions across the world, we can see there's a strong relationship between GDP per capita and again, investment in innovation as measured by R&D. So it seemed to be in some ways, if you're going to get to a successful position, a region's going to get to a successful position, it certainly needs to be undertaking innovation. And there's a whole range of theories thinking about this that have developed over the years. One strand of theory is thinking about how do regions actually innovate. So different forms of regional innovation theories. And then other forms of theories which say, well, how does innovation actually propel regional growth? And across that, we can see there's two types. One is largely saying it's about resource-based frameworks. So thinking about investments in certain forms of capital. And then the second one is around the interaction-based framework. So we know all these particular terms that have developed over the years. And now we start to think more around ecosystems, et cetera, entrepreneurial ecosystems, that we've moved away from clusters, the Italian research around industrial districts. But a lot of it is around thinking about the interaction. So that's all well and good, takes us so far. Where does all this interaction come from? What is it premised upon? And in a way, the theory has grown now, saying, well, it comes from the particular institutions within regions, or the institutions that impact on cities and regions. And this is largely a theory based around what can or can't you do? What are you constrained as a firm or as an individual in terms of behavior in a certain way? Or how are you incentivized to act in particular ways? And what are the organizational arrangements? Could it be through the market? Could it be through networks, etc.? And this theory is quite rapidly permeated, as we know, within urban and regional development theory. And we can think about institutions as being humanly devised constraints. So they're coming from human behavior, that structure, human interaction. They could be more formal based upon law, or maybe more informal and actually become embedded within sort of conventions and cultures in a way. But overall, they consist of the rules of the game. And the argument is that more efficient rules facilitate growth and development. Many different typologies in terms of institutions. Two, I think, of value to us. One is around thinking the difference between economic institutions and political institutions. Economic institutions in terms of individual property rights, or maybe contracts, patent laws, etc. So again, things like that are important in terms of maybe generating innovation, and then political institutions as well, which again will set the rules and regulations, largely at a national level, but we know more and more in terms of thinking about changes, in terms of the quality of government, etc., and governance within cities and regions. And another way, as I mentioned already, is either being more informal, de facto, or more formal, de jure, either from the law or just practice and conventions. And of particular interest to us is whether they could be maybe extractive institutions or maybe inclusive. If they're extractive, maybe probably a limited number of organizations or individuals are benefiting from these. So we can see it being rent-seeking behavior that in the long term will probably have a negative effect on the development trajectory of a city or region. So as Andres Rodriguez Poza said it's the institution stupid in many ways. And we can see there's different types of institutions that can all impact on the rules of the game that, again, will subsequently have their own impact in terms of the development trajectories of cities and regions. Do the theories interact? Well, both we can see as being endogenous in nature, coming from within particular spaces. Preferences and investment decisions tend to be shaped by prevailing institutions, or you'd say there's certainly a symbiotic relationship there. And again, you probably need a particular capital base to actually put together a certain incentive framework in terms of the overall institutional and organizational arrangements. So bringing these two together, I think takes us in a positive direction in terms of understanding the nature of development. But all these decisions come from individual human decision-making. So we don't really say a lot around in these theories around particular behavior. And economics, we know a certain strand of economics to start to say a lot more about this in terms of thinking about behavioral economics, and the notion coming from sort of Herbert Simon's work around bounded rationality, where he argues that you've got restrictions to human information processing in terms of limits of knowledge and computational capacities, basically saying that we haven't got a full understanding. And I think my argument with Thompson in a way is that different cities and regions have a different capacity within these areas, and in that way make different decisions that will again impact in terms of the capital and the institutions. And Michael Storper's own work started to explore this back in 2013 when he was talking about some of these individual decision-making comes from local influences, experienced through situations, very much embedded in the contextual conditions of the region, and stem back to maybe cultural issues. And I would say stem back from psychological factors as well. And I'll come on to that. And this is what Thompson, myself, tried to explore it in this book we published last year, in terms of thinking about different development paths and how these can be related to particular behavioural factors across these cities and regions. And we argue, yes, that the socioeconomic systems and subsystems are important, and these networks, but they come from particular behavioural traits. So we need to explore some of these behavioural traits and to see if they influence particular development trajectories, and in particular, the different forms of agency. Within this book, we've developed this behavioural agency. Again, this could be cut up in many different ways, but we're trying to think about what types of agents actually impact in terms of the development of cities and regions. And we said this, maybe we put them in sort of three categories: entrepreneurs, those involved in the political arena, and then workers themselves. And then we've drawn then from what the psychologists use in terms of their categories. Personal agency, obviously operating as an individual, trying to create change. Collective agency, working together and in a more networked way. Or proxy agency, the way that I may ask you to actually, or I may ask a politician to do something on behalf of me that I think will be positive. So again, we try to think about the different types of agents who again will impact in terms of change. And there's a lot more work around this now developing around those doing work around sort of path development work and thinking about new path creation. And again, all this work is evolving. And then in a stylized way, we say, well, ideally, you want to be in what we might call a positive lock-in region, one that's moving in a positive way, moving upwards, or you could be trapped into this negative lock-in. And we can see it in terms of the types of agency, the types of culture, and the types of institutions. And really arguing that within the positive lock-in, they can tolerate change and they promote change. We have agents promoting particular institutional cultural changes, whereas in the weaker regions, they tend to be more static. The same with culture as well. Median regions have the ability to absorb and create more diversity, whereas in weaker regions, we see more homophilia across time, less change. And again, in terms of institutions, positive lock-in regions tend to have more inclusive institutions compared to those which are more extractive and rent-seeking. So now we understand that agency does play a role alongside institutions and capital in terms of understanding urban and regional development. So I'm trying to find out a little bit more about the types of agencies that matter. And I was just trying to find one data set I could draw upon, which may not be fully comprehensive, that could be useful. And I look back to Peter Hall's book from 1998, Cities in Civilization. And he has about 30 chapters, I think, looking at particular regions and cities over points in time when they've been at their real peak in terms of innovation. And I've done some analysis with peers again, actually. We read all the chapters. This is only a selection of them. And we done an analysis in terms of which names or which individuals were mentioned the most. Again, this was just down in terms of Hall's own interpretation. But we found for each of the cities or regions that there are about 20 agencies within each that will really seem to be the key catalysts. Again, these sort of key agents may be coming from an entrepreneurial perspective, maybe many from political, but also worker agents as well. And again, we could see these as being maybe the leaders that produced and propelled the change within these particular places. But where did that come from? Why were they acting in that certain way? So we're trying to take it backwards And what we said we try to do is establish what we might call a behavioural profile of regions. We started off, we said maybe it just comes on the right-hand side from the culture within these cities or regions. And we've done some research. It's this chart from a paper published in Regional Studies. And we developed this idea of community culture, where the place is acting more collective in terms of what they may be involved in more risky crime-breaking activity. We pulled upon some of the work from Gert Hofstede, who've done some of the work at a national level in terms of thinking about difference in national cultures. And we developed this typology, and we could see there is a relationship between maybe what we might call the community culture and the economic culture. And as we were doing the work, at the same time, then there was this more emergent strand of research that was trying to think about some of the psychological factors within cities and regions and how that might have an impact. And in particular, thinking about what they call this, the psychologists call the big five traits, the way we can actually define people's personalities around how open are you, how conscientious are you in terms of being hardworking? Are you an extrovert or more of an introvert? Do you tend to be more agreeable, able to work with others, or less cooperative? And in terms of emotional stability as well. And there was this emerging strand of research which said having a particular set of psychological traits within a city or region is likely to impact other factors, particularly around rates of entrepreneurship, innovation, etc. But again, this is just emerging at this moment in time. So what myself and Piers Thompson did together, we said, well, if we can bring these two together, local community culture and this local personality psychology, maybe that forms something what we might call the local psychoculture of a city or region. And if we can measure that, we can begin to think if it has a relationship with some of these other economic change factors in terms of things around types of economic activity, industrial structure, and then overall levels of development, particularly as measured by productivity. And this was what we explored. This was the paper that came out from the book, the one that was mentioned in the outset by Julia in economic geography, where we're lucky. And in the UK, there was a survey done a number of years ago by the BBC and by Cambridge University, where they done a survey of 500,000 people across UK to measure their personality profile, a sort of Myers-Briggs survey. And given that there's 500,000, there's enough observations to actually take that down to a local authority level. So what we've done with our research is say we want to have two measures. One is around the personality profile, and one is around the cultural profile. And we developed two. One we called the CO, which is basically saying conscientious, open, and extrovert. And we'd argue that if places have more of this, they're more likely to be associated with those economic activities that promote high levels of productivity and probably innovation as well. And on the cultural side, we call it the EDI, engaged in terms of thinking about engage with education, engage with society, levels of diversity, and people actually act relatively individualistically. Seem to be you might be a sort of an argument around being go-getters in a way. So we could develop two different measures across the local authority areas of the UK, and we can see there is some diversity. And we can see if you look at sort of around the southeast London, you can see the higher levels of both the CO and the EDI are actually clustered and concentrated. And in the paper, we do some regression analysis, and we show there is a relationship between both factors and both factors together as well with GVA per employee. But just if you think about it bivariately, we can see positive relationship between GVA and the CO measure, and also with the EDI as well. So this begins to suggest that maybe behavioral factors play a role in how regions evolve over time. And this sort of relates to theories around what we'd call now evolutionary economic geography and how paths develop. And we know a lot of this stems back from the original seminal work by Ron Martin and Peter Sunley. And as they say, regions change. It's a never-ending interplay of path dependence, path creation, and destruction. Things are always changing, but what are they rooted within? To me, I say they're rooted within changes in the capital, the institutions, and the human behavior. But in terms of this path development, what types of paths can regions take? And the literature, this work from Arne Isaacan and Jacobson, saying, well, maybe there's 4 types of different development paths that can be taken. One is around path extension, where we see some small changes over time within particular industries and technological paths within cities and regions. Path upgrading, more major changes within an existing path. These are triggered through the use of new technologies. So using new technologies or maybe different forms of organization. Path renewal, where we're bringing together, maybe recombining different types of activities, which are either related or unrelated forms of knowledge. So packaging different forms of technology and skills, etc., in different ways. And then I guess what is the holy grail in a way for positive development is new path creation. Is bringing together new industries, technological paths that tend to be of high value added, based on new forms of local innovation, even though the knowledge itself may be imported or may be already being used elsewhere. And we know a lot of this thinking in this evolutionary perspective stems back to the work of Nelson and Winter's book, An Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change. I think it was published in 1982. And they started to think about, in a way, of saying, well, maybe we can sort of model the economy and the market and networks from a biological perspective. So they were the first ones to start up to think about ecosystem development in a way. And they were applying a lot of the factors around thinking about rules, etc., routines. So really it was embedded there. Their theory is embedded within institutional theory. And they say that the core concern of evolutionary theory within the dynamic process by which firm behavior patterns and market outcomes are jointly determined over time. So they're already trying to bring together different forms of theory and thinking within that behavior, although maybe not thinking about human behavior, but thinking about the decision-making of firms, the understanding and sort of bringing together different types of thinking. And a lot of their theories, I would say, is sort of rooted. You could take it back maybe to some of the classics in terms of Smith, Veblen, but in particular Schumpeter. Is it thinking about that? Schumpeter was one of the first to recognize the role of factors such as innovation, the role of entrepreneurs in driving forward innovation, and understanding this, evolving, constantly changing environment. And of course, obviously, when he coined the term creative destruction. So again, this has been heavily adopted within evolution and within economic geography and within regional studies in thinking about how we may be moved along different forms of paths across different types of cities and regions. And where does this come from over time, moving from maybe where there was little in terms of what existed within industries, but then moving through this process of path creation, maybe either become locked in and maybe moving on to new paths as well. And the connections between what's happened endogenously or indigenously within a region and how this is affected by changes from outside, which we see in Wales really was heavily dependent on coal and some of the more traditional sectors around that. But over time, exogenous factors meant that they weren't obviously going to be created or demanded from that region. And this just looks at some of the cycles that industries take, and we know some of them they move along a sort of an S curve, and we can see that could be adopted and used in thinking about regions as well, because obviously these industries will be concentrated in clusters within particular regions. So I quite like this chart by Martin and Sunny back in the 2006 paper, where they say there's two regions here, an A and a B. There's various points in time. There's different routes that could be taken that either move to either positive or negative lock-in. The A region tends to move upwards in terms of a positive, whereas the B region seems to be taking the negative lock-in and going down. And in a way, sort of mirrors that difference between London and Wales at the beginning, particularly since the post-1970s period. So if we think about this new path creation, we need to perhaps try to have a better understanding of the process and how we can conceptualize this process. And I've been doing some work, again, with Thompson, thinking about maybe there's 3 areas, 3 dimensions. We don't use phase or stage because it sort of reflects, there's a lot of non-linearities. It's not just a linear process and feedback loops. And we try to talk it about in terms of new path potential, new path formation, and then an actualization as well. And we try to look at different types of regions to understand. But again, this understanding in terms of non-linearity and these feedback loops. And when we started thinking about that, it took us, in terms of thinking about some of the mechanisms, it took us back to the literature around complex adaptive systems, because complex adaptive systems is ideal in a way for trying to think about context that involves culture, this idea of bounded rationality of behavior, and understands alongside issues around emergence, adaptive behavior, but as well as understanding that the process of regional development is very non-linear, so very difficult to predict. We can't just say we're going to have so much input, we're going to get this level of output, and then we're going to get these sort of outcomes. It's very difficult to predict, and this is emerging from the literature. So again, it's a complex area to understand because it's operating through systems that are complex, multiple in terms of those involved, the actors involved, and the relationships between them, and then adaptive because, again, they're constantly changing over time. And if we think about where has been the biggest success, maybe over the last 20 years or so, in terms of becoming regions that have taken that positive path lock-in, has been around cities, isn't it? And a lot of the literature has been focused around cities. They've been the ones who've been seen to have these complex adaptive systems that have been able to propel innovation. And in a way, cities have been seen as the crucibles of innovations. And then we know there's a plethora of literature around it. We can take it back maybe to Florida's Rise of the Creative Class, 2001, 2002, Glazer's own book around the triumph of the city, where he looks at all the numerous factors that make cities the places to be in a way. And then more recently, Sharon Zukin wrote this book just prior to the pandemic, actually, The Innovation Complex, where she looks at, in a critical way, she looks at the emergence of New York as a new tech center to maybe rival Silicon Valley in a way. And that was moved away just from being sort of fintech to wider areas. And again, so it would seem that cities have something in their mix that has allowed them to develop on these positive trajectories. And this is just a chart from the World Intellectual Property Report back in 2019. And they say there's a strong relationship between the density of innovation and the density of people. And that where people is, maybe seems common sense to some extent, largely coincides with where innovation actually occurs, which again maybe starts to tell us something more about behaviors. And if you start to look at some of this literature, this is a book, I think this was published, 2019, Safi Bakal. He published this book called Loon Shots, and he's looking at disruptive innovation, innovations that people thought would never happen in a way. And again, he's focused on the idea, he says that large groups of people are needed to translate these technologies into particular outputs. So again, start to think about the need for density in a way. And why would this be the case? It seems to be that cities, are they operating in an efficient environment? Not necessarily so. They have lots of resources. They have lots of people. But again, there's this tolerance for failure. Many of the ventures, the entrepreneurs in cities, don't actually come to any fruition. But it would seem to be that the few make up for the many. And within a sort of evolutionary context, it's the ability to actually tolerate inefficiencies of cities that provide the most fertile framework for economic growth. That's not to say that they're inefficient in terms of the institutions, but it's the ability for these systems, maybe these complex adaptive systems, to be able to tolerate that maybe you're going to be doing certain things, you're going to be funding certain factors. They may not come into positive outcomes, but the overall, as I say, the few will make up for the many. When you start back to look back at the literature, if you look back to it's from Jane Jacobs in The Economy of Cities, and she has a chapter back in 1969 talking about Birmingham, I think, in the UK, when Birmingham was a very a strong city. And she starts to sort of notice, really, when she analyzes it, she said these cities are actually, they're quite inefficient in many ways, for many of the reasons I've already just mentioned. And she says, really, they can't be seen as being deficiencies, because it is, in fact, it's the efficiency and impracticality that makes them successful. So again, this goes back, and she talks around complexity in a way. She doesn't use the term complex adaptive cities, but she begins to understand having the wealth of resources in a way, and that you're not always going to see a linear relationship. There's another book that came out a few years ago, Edward Tenner. He says something very similar. He talks about the efficiency paradox. He argues when a seemingly inefficient institutional framework allows agents to productively learn from the random. And we know about maybe these ideas of random networks developing within cities can actually lead to very positive outcomes. And what we've seen, in particularly so, I think, since the financial crisis, we've seen within cities the development of these complex adaptive systems that have been framed within the literature more and more now as being entrepreneurial ecosystems. And we've seen over that period of time, there's a lot of data to show that people have been attracted to these cities to try to start up technology-based businesses, particularly digital technologies. Firms are increasingly taking their headquarters to these cities, and the development of co-working spaces, incubators, etc. This all attests to the pull of cities in recent years as having the key resources around innovation, both at a firm level and at a human behavioral level as well. So I could probably stop the presentation there in a way, because that would all seem well and good, and then we're going to see the continued success of cities. But of course, we've had the pandemic in a way, which I guess is testing the validity of the theory around the pull of cities, and cities having all these resources, mechanisms and processes that allow positive economic change. But we know since COVID, there's been arguments that have come around as saying that the world's going to be less urban, and there's going to be less global as well. This is just some highlight back in 2020 saying that we've seen the end of peak globalization, and again maybe some of the dismantling of cities as being these innovation hubs. And there was a series of literature that came out from different sources that was saying maybe we're going to see some kind of fragmentation and shift away from these large global innovation hotspots. I don't think we know the answer yet. We've certainly seen some changes, I would say. I'll give my own view on it. I think from what I'm reading is that a lot of these innovation organizations, businesses, entrepreneurs are not going to leave in large numbers away from the city. They may move to different cities in a way. Much of the activity within the US, as they call them, innovation districts, is still happening within an urban environment. And if this is to be believed, this startup ecosystem ranking from 2020, much of the research undertaken with regards to coronavirus or COVID and etc. Has been undertaken within cities and still within some of those the key leading locations. What I think is happening, and which I think has started already prior to COVID, is that we're beginning to see a more emerged system in terms of innovation, as well as these innovation hub cities. So these big, your Londons, your Parises, your Berlins, your New York, and increasingly in Los Angeles, obviously Shanghai, Tokyo, and some others around the world. We're going to see more satellites around it, medium-sized second-tier cities playing more of a role within the global innovation system. And we're going to see more connectivity across them. And like there's a number of different forces. One is obviously around the continued search for new ideas and knowledge. They're not all just going to be within one large city, and they're going to grow up elsewhere. Yes, there's going to be the pull of agglomeration, but amenity may be more available, or the types of amenity that people are searching for maybe within the smaller cities. And again, some of these behavioral aspects and around the negative, we know around the traditional negative externalities around cost, congestion, etc. Maybe there's going to be a long-term, I'm not sure to what extent there will be some kind of long-term impact from this sort of fear maybe of being near people. But I still think we're going to see a lot of activity within cities, and there's still a need to think about what lagging regions can do. I've said about cities, I'm just going to finish off just saying something about more around lagging and peripheral regions. If I go back to my model around new path creation, around potential formation and actualization, in terms of potential, is thinking about the types of human agents that are within these regions and the types of networks that they develop. On the right-hand side here, this is sort of the weaker regions where they have maybe the wrong type of behavior or a different type of behavior, and the different type of networks that don't actually stimulate new path potential. And there's a need for those to sort of leap over to this side, where they can have a higher degree of particular types of this open, diverse behavior. And again, these open and inclusive networks, flat and equitable networks, I think, which can propel development. Is it happening? The literature starts to tell us yes, in certain locations around the world. I've just pulled up 3 papers here, fairly recent, which begins, I think we're looking at within Switzerland, the middle one by Phil Roundy within the US, and then one in Sweden as well. Each of these 3 papers tells a story that these places have started to develop new development paths, create new development paths, and then put together building on particular agents, either within the region or externally, and started to develop new networks that have allowed them to enter into new sectors, or at least to rebuild and renew other sectors as well. So we can see there's examples of new path potential within lagging regions. The other one, in terms of formation, we need to the next stage, in where we try to gather stronger levels of collective agency, and thinking about the strategic networks that are required to push forward new development, and strategic networks based on strong leadership and distributed power across a range of different actors. So again, it's a matter for the lagging regions to sort of flip from this side over to that side. Again, I was looking at the literature. I found some quite interesting examples. And some of this is linked to some of the literature around smart specialization in a way. I think where we are beginning to see some positive developments coming from these ways of trying to put together new strategies to build on existing assets to enter new development paths. One from my colleague Adrian Healy, he was looking at what was happening actually in northeast Romania, one of the weakest regions within Europe, where they started to develop this new strategy. And we got this book has come out from Bazotta and others, which looks at numerous different examples, different regions, Poland, etc., which shows how they're beginning to change their development fortunes. And then some work from David Dollerer and Steve Dion looking at, it's a little bit older, this paper came back from 2008, looking at Pocatier in Canada, which is really sort of slid down in terms of its status, but again, it's sort of becoming revived. So again, some nice literature there. And then finally, again, maybe the sort of the holy grail is to actually develop systems that have high levels of complexity, adaptability, not to necessarily mimic what was happening in the strong city regions, but actually to maybe give yourselves the capacity to become stronger over time and to enter different and new and multiple development paths. And again, I've just put up another 3. I'm working on a book at this chapter this point in time where I'm going to try to pull together some of these examples. But again, we've got one here from the right-hand side, Luis Carvalho and Maria Vale, looking at the central region of Portugal has developed itself as a new biotech center, bringing together numerous assets around hospitals, the universities there, and some key entrepreneurs. The middle one, back in 2013, but it's a fascinating story that shows the development of one of the most peripheral regions, really, I guess, in Europe within Sweden, and how it's developed itself as an automotive testing cluster, which you would, it took numerous years to do it, but, it's taken off in a way, and it's an interesting story. And then Arnie Isaacson and Michaela Triple look at 2 regions around Norway and Austria. They really led, I think, some of the research and thinking about new path creation and thinking about the different routes allowed. So again, we can see there is a literature that not just focus around the regions and the cities that we know about, but some of these peripheral regions that are having a positive effect. So I'll just wrap up. I'm coming towards, I think, the end of my hour. What are some of the implications for this? I would argue, since I've written the book with peers now, I would say that we do need to try to integrate behavioral theories within economic development. And I think it will give us a better understanding of the types and mix of policies, investments that can work in terms of facilitating productivity gains and economic development. If we look at, and we're aware, there's been too strong to call it wastage, but we can see there's been so much public investment within regions that has not seen any public value in a way. And we know there's going to be less investment. We're going to see the shrinking of investment pools, often as a result now maybe of COVID, but there's so many other uncertainties in the world. We're going to have to think, we have to be a lot smarter. We can't build and expect people to come. We need to have an understanding if they are going to come or could come based on some of this behavioral profiles. And now we can have more integrated policy solutions that account for the possibility of existing behavior, and where the behavior can be changed. So we know I wrote this first bullet point a while back, but throughout much of the 21st century to date, we've seen there's been a relatively volatile macroeconomic framework. Well, we're within that again now, given the Ukraine and other uncertainties. Regions themselves must understand how they can change behaviorally as a result of some of these exogenous effects, but actually maybe catalyzing endogenously their own changes as well, bringing together, the outside and the inside. And, inevitably this is a tall order for the majority of lagging and uncompetitive regions if they're going to try to beat the odds and enter these new phases of development. Should we not bother in many ways? Well, certainly not. My emphatic answer is that policy can play a role and regions should seek to implement them. How do we do that? Well, I've tried to give some insights today from both positive lock-in regions and how negative regions can maybe switch themselves to a more positive direction. To me, I think one answer is to start to look at some of the exceptions. I've been doing some research. I've highlighted about 9 different pieces there to start off with, and to try to pull out some lessons around that in terms of what they've done and what, instead of not trying to just mimic or mirror what has happened there, but just to think about the processes and to go back to thinking about their fundamentals in terms of the drivers, what was in place in terms of institutions, types of behavior, what types of systems and networks will exist, and what processes we used. Particularly all of those, if you read those, were about stories around entrepreneurship in many ways. Either entrepreneurship that was within the region or that was tend to be imported from elsewhere. So I shall leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Professor Huggins, also for limiting your talk to 1 hour. Thank you very much. So now we can open the floor, and as usual, we leave the floor first and foremost to our students, because our webinar are primarily addressed to them. So if you have any question for Professor Huggins, this is the time. And Maria Giovanna, I wait for you if there are questions from YouTube. There's always this ice-breaking moment, but at some point yes.
It's always the same at all, that's right.
Yeah. So we have Carlo Capolali, who is a PhD student here at the GSSI. Thanks, Carlo. Sorry, Carlo, we can't hear you. Or at least I can't.
No, me.
No, I can't either. Maybe we can see if someone else has a question.
You can,
you
can hear me now?
Yes,
Okay.
Carlo, now yes.
Okay, sorry. So I'll try to break the ice saying that this is very amazing, this attempt to considering the human part of the economic development, which is also the most difficult task in this sense, I guess. So based on the work that I'm trying to do with my research in the PhD, during the PhD, where do you place the role of violence in its broad understanding, from the, I don't know, higher criminal rates into the urban environment to the violence intended as a structural part of a society in the development path that you explained and that you are analyzing?
Okay, thank you, Carlo.
Thank you.
The way in our research that we've positioned it is within our community culture measure. So we look at levels of crime, etc., not necessarily violence. And in a way, we can see as a cultural and institutional factor. And we can clearly see that obviously there are different levels of crime, etc., across local areas. They're often fairly proximate to each other, because we see changes in sort of socioeconomic status, and which we particularly see within cities. So we put it with the cultural measures, and I think the way I would see it again, as for you maybe to take it forward, is to try to see ways, efforts to try to combat that violence. And then looking at things around maybe some of the measures around quality of governance that have been put together. Myself and peers, what we did as well, when we measured, we sort of used the Sharon quality of governance put together at the regional level. We done a local one for the UK, and we looked at issues around policing and measures of security that way. And actually, the higher the level of policing, didn't always show to be positively related to economic development, but maybe the higher levels of policing is a result of the fact that there's more crime in the first instance. So it was difficult to maybe understand some of the causality. But that's where I would position it. There's probably other research, which you may be aware of, they're not aware of, that comes at a national level within institutional theory that starts thinking about how we position violence within that. I know there's been some other work done by Italian researchers as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Robert. Other questions from our students or students who might be connected? I can see a hand raised, but I can't see the name.
Julia, I'm not a student. I raised my hand, but I'm just waiting until someone else wants to talk first, because I'm definitely not a student. So I was just raising my hand.
I couldn't see your name. Okay, it was just JSSI. Okay, would you like to start to make your question while waiting for students?
Okay. Robert, very interesting presentation. Really, really interesting. You showed us so much material, lots of idea came to mind. I agree totally in terms of looking at behavioral explanation of like spatial disparities, all sorts of economic phenomena. And it's funny because I see Stephen Shepard asking you a question in the chat, and Stephen was my previous advisor when I was doing the PhD, and we are kind of aiming at the same thing. It's amazing, because the thing that I've noticed the most, it's the piece that you showed on personality traits. And the reason being that in 2020, I published a paper with an ex-PhD student of mine from Ohio State University. And we were looking at the relationship between these 5 personality traits and migration patterns. And what we found, it was an Australian database, 17,000 people. And what we found was that there was a relationship between being more open and more extrovert and having a higher propensity to migrate. And there was no reverse causality. So we found this. So I have 2 questions on this. First, well, you can also answer Stephen, because he was asking if these data were available for multiple years. Okay. But my question was, what did you know about these people whose personality traits you knew about? Did you know, for instance, if they moved, if they were going from one place to another, like we did for the Australian data to look at migration and personality traits? First question. The second is, at the end, you showed us something related to COVID. And I was just thinking about behavior, right? COVID has changed our behavior. So I was wondering, there is a lot of talk about smart working and the fact that maybe people will move to peripheries because there will be relocation of businesses, or because they can work from far away. So all the smart working literature now, it's growing very fast. But I haven't seen anybody saying, well, COVID changed our behavior for good. So for instance, I'm a very open, extroverted person, but believe me, after 2 years of COVID, I feel less open, I feel less extrovert, maybe, I don't feel like moving nearly as much. This is just me, and I'm just thinking about, what the effect might have been on people. And so maybe this is also affecting their propensity to move around, their propensity to migrate. So it's not just the opportunity provided by the fact that there is smart working, but also, as you were pointing out, behavioral changes in people due to the COVID. We are now different people. And so I was wondering if something on this line of research might be possible. I know that we don't have data as recent as 2022 or 2021, secondary data on the personality traits of people, but maybe could be collected or something. If you think that COVID might have changed our behavior and hence everything that goes with it, including migration.
Okay, so there's three questions that include in the one on the chat as well, isn't it, by Stephen? Yeah. So I'll take those. What did we know about, or what do we know about the 500,000? We don't know that much. We know where they're located, but we don't have other characteristics so much around whether they've migrated or not. But we thought this as well around looking at to see if there's a relationship between what we call the psychocultural profile and migration patterns. So what we have one chapter or part of a chapter in that book that looks at migration patterns across regions within the UK, from sort of stronger to weaker regions, so moving in and out. And we also know then the psychocultural traits of that locality. So we did some analysis around that, and we found that maybe, as you'd expect, in localities where there is higher levels of openness, extrovertness, you do tend to see more movement of people. And that tends to be those, we would assume that those who maybe were originally based in a location that was overall low in terms maybe of extroversion and maybe was more closed, but their own personality trait was out of sync with that, they would move to a place which is more aligned to their own personality. And we can see that, isn't it? Maybe people moving from rural areas to the more urban areas, which have that more co and EDI traits. So we did some analysis around that, but we're speculating in many ways in terms of some of the reasons around that. COVID. So we can conceptualize the fact that I can't really just face booking a holiday to go overseas this year as being an institutional factor, isn't it now? The incentive and constraints have changed the way that we perceive the positive and benefits from undertaking those endeavors. But you're right, we don't know whether that institutional barrier that's been put up is going to be equally as impact upon all types of people and upon all types of those within particular locations. I think we're going to need to give a bit more time in a way, isn't it? And then we can start thinking about what have been the changes. What would be the difference in changes across different types of places if movement of people. But it would be interesting then to relate that to those psychocultural behavioral factors. We readily acknowledged in all our work that the lack of time series data is a barrier, particularly from the from both factors really, from the personality side and from the cultural side. To some extent, where on the cultural side we just restricted to the survey data, which as you know within UK some is restricted to every 10 years, and on the psychological side that was a one-off survey. I'm not aware of any plans for that to be done again. It would be great if it could be done. But we certainly need to have, we've obviously put some lags and stuff in our analysis, but it would be a lot stronger and would give us a lot more insights if we were able to do it in a more longitudinal sense. And in particular, to try to track the impact of some of these changes in terms of different types of human agency. My own thinking is, having spent a few years doing this behavioural stuff, if it's going to get taken seriously by policymakers, we need to. The next stage of the work needs to be thinking about trying to find what really it can be used to inform better policy making. If you look at in the private sector investment, I was talking to a private sector investor in shopping malls, and where they say they're going to build shopping malls. And they use so much behavioral data of understanding whether people would shop there, what would they shop for, the amount of data they had. These are private capital investors. They contacted me actually because they were interested in the stuff that I was doing, but I wanted their data in the end because it was such a heavy level of detail compared to what we had. And I think we need to try to convince the government, public sectors to try to at least collect data at the level that the private sector uses in terms of making serious decisions, because otherwise I think the public sector investments are still going to be in a weak position. I often tell the story around within the UK, within Wales, a number of years ago, that they just built without any market intelligence or behavioral intelligence a series of business incubators across Wales. And they suddenly expected these to be populated by local entrepreneurs. They hadn't really done any research into thinking about was the type of entrepreneurial behavior existing in that area, and would it be attracted to these types of incubators? And more than half of them just went under. They were just ghost buildings, really, and they had to be reconverted or whatever into something else. And I would argue if there'd been some sort of behavioral profiling around that, there'd be a better understanding. So I think that's the next phase of development if we're going to get taken seriously.
Thank you, Robert. I see that there's Jansu who raised her hand, but would you like to previously answer Stephen's question on the chat? So are these data being collected on an ongoing basis? Are they available for other years?
Well, most of the data say that we have is a one-off in a way. We can update some of the data, more readily available data, but it was a difficult task to do in trying to get harmonized data just for the one period in many ways. Because as we say, it's an emerging area of research. Maybe we can try to think about influencing household surveys and things like that to include some of these measures. One issue is because it's quite sensitive data, isn't it, really? When you're asking people about their behavior and whether they may be neurotic or they may be more emotionally stable in a way. So there is, and the whole area of research is quite sensitive, because you're sort of saying, well, you may be trying to sort of social engineer changes within particular localities, cities, or region. So we do need to tread carefully, but no, there is no long-term ongoing. It matters trying to use what we've got and make the best of that at this moment in time.
Thank you. Now, Jansu, another PhD student from JSSI, and then Boris. Thank you very much, Robert, for your sharing your interesting research. Especially, it took my attention, like how you analyze social psychology of the regions economically. And my question is that I was wondering about the personality traits and also behavioral profile of the regions. So, like as you said, like this, especially the personality types, a conscientious, open extrovert, and also the engaged, diverse, individualistic personalities that in the local areas likely to be associated with those economic activities that promote productivity and economic growth, but also maybe in this like if we think about the lagging or more like less developed, let's say less developed regions, we also see a kind of community culture which consists of this extrovert conscientiousness, personality types that they come together and then they kind of not promote the economic growth that they think this economic growth will be the disadvantage for the wider community and also the environment. I'm basically thinking about my research experiences, and then also considering what you just told us. So, I mean, what do you think regarding this behavioral profile of the regions? That these regions, especially lagging or less developed economically, we can say, that and have this kind of personality types behaviorally. They created a community and take collective actions against the economic growth that they think it's not okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good question. Is thinking about the process again, I think, in terms of how you stimulate economic change, and going back to that, what I was talking about in terms of potential formation and actualization. I think for it to catalyze change within any region, you need to have some of these agents, I call them, have high levels of dissonance. And that means thinking differently or thinking about perhaps outside the box of what can be achieved within the region. If everyone just thought the same and we're going to stay like this, nothing will happen. So I think you need to have like a pool, as I said, maybe around 20 or whatever people that think differently. So they haven't got that fit with the environment in a way. I think once you've got that, I think the next stage in the process, as I mentioned in the presentation, in terms of the formation, is bringing those together, is trying to build some collective agency across them. And I think that's what happens in regions that don't move forward. And a bit like what Alexandra says, you have these guys who may be individualistic and can move on with it, and they're within a weaker region, but then they just think, well, I'm just going to move elsewhere to the stronger region, which is in a way is the easier option. Some of those papers I mentioned earlier are lagging regions within Europe, or maybe within the US. They've gone through a process of identifying those individuals, largely entrepreneurs, empowering them and building them into a network that's clearly public and private sector driven. And what I've drawn upon, I won't go into so much detail now, is some of the literature now that's coming from entrepreneurship around effectuation and causal logics. Causal logics is basically the way that public policy works, isn't it? They say, we're going to input this amount of money and we hope then we'll create this change within this region. More effectual thinking is what entrepreneurs think. They think it's a bit like smart specialization. They think, well, what have we got? who's in the network, how can we mobilize it the best that we can do. When I was looking at those examples, they were bringing together the two together. And within a network, so you got these two types of logics competing in a way around being effectual and causal, but working together to try to create change. It's the same with where I am now in Wales. There's a strong community because of coming from coal mining, etc. Very high in terms of social cohesion, social capital and trust. We're trying to find ways to use that in a positive way. Kevin Morgan in this region now is working a lot around sort of foundational economy, etc., social enterprise, which I think is having a positive change and is using some of the positive resources and behavioral traits that we have. But I think alongside that, we need to, appreciate that long-term benefits going to come from having a more innovative, higher value economy as well. So we need to be working on both. Sometimes the traits that we have can be used in a positive way, but in other ways, we need to find these different types of agents who think differently, who can then catalyze other change and start building the economy.
Thank you, Robert, for the exhaustive answer. Now we have Boris, another student, first year student of our PhD. Please, Boris.
All right. So Robert, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It's extremely interesting, and I think it's high time that behavioral economics enters economic geography, and I think the work you're doing is really, really relevant. And also, what I find relevant is the shift towards agency from more structural explanations we've been seeing in economic geography. And I have, let's say, one remark and one question. And the remark is regarding the usage of psychographic profiling, psychographic data in business decisions. I think you mentioned that you've been working or discussing with an investor or retail location. Because before entering the PhD, I used to work in marketing and fast-moving consumer goods. And it's driven only, I would say, or 90% by the detailed psychographic, description of the groups, segments of customers, quantifying them and targeting them with, different products, marketing, and so on and so forth. So business has been doing it for a good couple of years or decades, I would say. And what I've seen is that this is also moving to the public sector, not as much in policy making as in public service delivery. I also had the chance to work on a design of urban lab in Warsaw in Poland. And the town hall was really, really paying a lot of attention to get the right segmentation and profiles of the users, potential users of the urban lab. So this type of thinking is entering public service delivery, I think. And the question I have, it's not my field of expertise, but I was wondering, how does your approach, behavioral approach, sees the social capital theory? So the Bourdieu and Putnam ideas of the bonding, bridging social capital, because at least in Poland, we've been having discussions about the differences between East and the West in terms of development as being to big extent driven by the lack of bonding social capital, of the ability to cooperate in the East as compared to the West. So I haven't read your book, maybe it's there, but my question is just, how does your theory sees the social capital theories of the 90s, I guess, 80s?
Yeah, it's another good question. You can see in the presentation that we've taken it down to two routes. One is around the psychological side, and one is down this notion of community culture. I developed notion around the community culture, what we call the socio-spatial culture, because of my dissatisfaction in the end with the social capital theory. Not because of any problems with Putnam or from anyone, but it just become rather meaningless in a way, because it seemed to include every type of, connection. And then you could begin to see some of it, well, social capital, but was it really, embedded in trust, etc. And as you say about the different types of links across different types of ties, I developed this other notion around network capital, more to measure around the flows of knowledge. So in the book and in our work, we've tried. We think social capital is, was great because it raised these issues in our mind around these cultural issues and the relation between these cultural issues and the economy. But in the end, we felt it was too limited. So we developed community culture. In the end, we've taken a lot of what Hofstede was doing at the national level in terms of his type of cultural measures. And if you know how he did it, he tried to develop these cultural measures of national culture because he had a contract with IBM back in the 1960s. And IBM at that point in time was the most multinational company in the world because they were already in basically every country. And he surveyed all IBM employees across the world. And he could develop them a measure across what was the IBM in Argentina compared to those in Brazil, et cetera, because he took a huge leap of faith of saying that what was the cultural traits of those people working in IBM, of those of the nation as a whole. And he's been criticized on that. We've taken that approach, but we've tried to measure it differently. We tried to measure it not just within IBM or within the company, tried to measure across the region. And in terms of social capital, it goes back to one of the earlier questions about how we might sort of mobilize a concept such as violence or crime as well. So what we're trying to do is to look upon a wider spectrum of socio-cultural factors. And we've moved away. We do use the term at times, social capital, but move away from using that because we find it a bit limiting in terms of what we're trying to explain in thinking about cultural differences across places and within them as well. But I do think, obviously, having some measures of bonding and bridging are useful, but I would use other measures around that as well. I use the term network capital to understand the linkage that creates or exchanges potentially economically beneficial knowledge, which goes back into the sort of the framework I've presented today. It's not a full answer, but that's
it's a good answer, at least for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Boris. Thank you, Robert. Are there any other questions from students, or we can open the floor to the audience and also to faculty members? So go ahead if you have some questions. Otherwise, in the meantime, I have one. Can I start? And then we collect eventually other questions. Actually, you touched upon a bit on my question when in your first answer, but I would like you to digger on this aspect, because my main research interest is on, in Italy we call them inner areas, which are areas substantially far from service provision centers, so peripheral areas, broadly meant. So they are areas mainly challenged from slow burning pressures, low density areas. So in a way, they are areas which seem to lack all the conditions for the basic conditions for innovations. I found the papers you showed us about lagging regions very interesting, but I would like you to dig more into non-urban areas, so the potentials for urban areas. And my question is, starting from these assumptions, so they are areas which seem to lack the conditions for innovation or growth for the one side. For the other side, we all know, community culture, social cultural factors are very slow in changing. There's a kind of inertia in a way. So my question is how to implement your approach from a policy perspective, and more particularly, on which dimension would you think that, which dimension would you think we can leverage in order to bring about some path-breaking trajectories in those areas which are locked in declining paths?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I think I read that. I think you had Richard Shermer speaking at one of your workshops maybe a while ago. And I think he makes some interesting remarks around this, because when we think about innovation, as he argues, really, innovation is taking place everywhere, but maybe different types of innovation. And most of the innovation maybe that gets measured is what he calls is coming from fast innovators, and those now may be around in terms of digital technologies, etc. And we know the economy itself is moving very fast. But as he argues, he says there's a lot of people who are slow innovators. And they're slow innovators that innovate in incremental way, maybe more in more traditional sectors. And he's done some work. And he says, and when you look at these slow innovators, they tend to be actually clusters within these very peripheral areas. And for them, actually, they can work to some extent in isolation. They don't really need to be heavily networked because they have their own trajectory of what they want to do, maybe in changing a product, process, or service. I don't know, right? But I would argue, I would suggest that these innovators probably are, from a psychological perspective, probably introverts, probably less agreeable, and probably less open. And because of that, they're probably not very well known. And they probably are not accessible by policymakers. I think there should be some way of trying to unearth these people. They're often outside of maybe traditional firms. They may be operating in other ways, and maybe around sort of social enterprise. I come from a rural area, a relatively rural area, outside of the core of Cardiff. I know some of these people as well. It's difficult for them to engage. They tend to be maybe perhaps more sort of cantankerous in a way, but they can offer a lot in terms of the development at a local and regional level. And I think if there were some mechanisms to actually connect them more to the wider economy and maybe to policy thinking, they have interesting stories to tell. Again, they are sort of dissonant in a way because they don't fit with the overall sort of psychocultural behavioral trait of the area. But if those could be mobilized, I think it could be quite powerful in a way. It's easy, to identify the high profile ones. We know they're in the media all the time. They're often in the urban areas. But the others, the ones who tend to be, I guess, in the sort of the more left behind places. So, and often I think as well, and I've argued for it to be done in the past, there are many people who are workers in just mainstream businesses that do have potential entrepreneurial flair. Now, there's workforce surveys all the time undertaken in terms of looking at their level of vocational skills or whatever. there's very little measured in terms of their potential entrepreneurial capacity to identify that. We do some of it now, don't we, really, in universities a little bit. I'm thinking about entrepreneurial education, but not much is done in terms of the workforce. Yes, it's done in sort of very large corporations when they're thinking about sort of, venture corporate, when they're trying to spin out companies, etc. But even in many traditional companies, I think there's hidden entrepreneurial talent that could be excavated within these weaker regions. So I think what I'm basically arguing is trying to identify those that are off the radar of mainstream government businesses or government or businesses. Hard work, but it could be very worthwhile.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Probably there are no other questions from the audience, I guess, because I don't see any other hand raised. So thank you very much, Robert, for this insightful seminar. And it was a pleasure to have you here virtually. And we hope that next time will be in person here in L'Aquila.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia. And thank you for everyone who's joined us today.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.